Hello, everyone. At the last panel, we've discussed construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of mainstream history by visual artists and curators. And now we will continue with similar issue, but from the perspective of diverse communities of Poles. I have 5 wonderful women with me on the panel. Let me introduce them briefly in the order they will speak in the first round of our interventions. So we have Dr. Margaret Amaka Ohaya-Nowak with us, who is a linguist, a critical discourse analyst, and a diversity and inclusion trainer. She's the president of Word Idea, a training company for promoting diversity and cross-cultural communication and combating racial discrimination and the violation of human rights of people of African descent in Poland. She received her PhD in linguistics from the University of Warsaw. She graduated from the Black Europe Summer School and Dimension of Citizenship, Race and Ethnic Relations. Margaret authored and co-authored lesson scenarios, educational materials, and scholarly publication on cross-cultural, human rights, anti-discrimination, and global educational topics. And I'm very glad she agreed to take part in our today's discussion. The second speaker will be Joanna Talewicz-Kwiatkowska, who holds PhD in anthropology. She is the author and editor of the books and articles on Roma communities, minorities, human rights. Currently, she works in the Institute of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Warsaw, and she cooperates with the Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau. She's a fellow of Islands for Historical Dialogue and Accountability Program at the Columbia University and a grantee of numerous institutions, including the Fulbright Program, the US State Department Program as an international visitor, a grantee of the Gypsy Lore Society, and a member of European Academic Network on Romani Studies. Our third speaker is Tuklin Nguyen Vu, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Research Center for the History of Transformation at the University of Vienna. Prior to Lin's relocation to Vienna, she worked at the Global History Division at the Friedrich Meinecke Institute at the Freie Universität Berlin, after earning her PhD from the EUY in Florence in 2019. Lin is currently working on 2 book manuscripts. The first one is on the political dissidents in late socialist Warsaw, but Lin's second book project is highly relevant to our panel, and it is on the modes and patterns of exchange between Poland and Vietnam under late socialism through the prism of migration, socialist pedagogy, and cultural exchange. Our fourth participant is Magda Rubenfeld-Koraleska, who is a social entrepreneur, cultural producer, and activist. Co-founder of Byte Krakow Association, the first post-war progressive Jewish community in Krakow, the Jews Not Painted Foundation, presenting illustrated 19th century history of Jews in Poland, and Festival Art, which is a Jewish art activism collective investigating complexities of the contemporary Jewish Poland. Magda currently works as Limud's regional coordinator for Central and Eastern Europe. She deals with the issues of Jewish memory, Polish-Jewish dialogue, informal Jewish education, and community engagement. She's co-authored of Participatory Intervention, offering a critical look at museums' collections. And finally, Karolina Ufa, who is a trainer, activist of Fundacja Q, where she is taking care of organizational archives. Fundacja Q, Foundation Q, in cooperation with Google Arts and Culture, opened the first Polish virtual LGBTQ+ museum and focuses on collecting, archiving, and disseminating materials about Polish queer history. Welcome again. And as I have already mentioned, the purpose of our panel is to explore how Polish museums look from the perspective of diverse communities of Poles. As museums are an important tool for shaping our collective memory and temporary imaginaries, we'll also consider new possibilities and practices for broadening the historical and cultural imaginaries of our National Museum present towards perhaps a bit more inclusive future. In short, I would like to ask our panelists 3 questions. First, what is the status quo in Polish museums from their perspective? What are their own curatorial dreams? What would it take to make those dreams to come true? Or what actions and strategies are already implemented or are was to implement? As we have activists, both scholars, activists, and people with some our participants have curatorial experience. I think it will be a really good and fruitful discussion. We'll start with a round of circa 8 minutes intervention from each speaker, who will tackle these issues from their own expert point of view. I invite the audience already to take part in the discussion or raise questions and comments in the chat. And after the first round, we'll engage with questions and comments. So without any further ado, I would like to start. And Margaret, the floor is yours right now.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for this nice introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Joanna said that we will be talking from our perspectives today, and because we don't have much time, but I do want to present my perspective in a nutshell, especially in this context of looking at museums and the museum discourses in Poland in particular. So I'm a Black woman, and I'm an Afro-Polish, and I position myself as a mixed race woman as well, as a Polish Nigerian, as a scholar, semi-scholar, because I'm also an anti-racist trainer, with a critical perspective on it. And I also position myself as myself. So I position my perspective as non-representative of the whole community. And I think it's important to highlight, and for me, it's really important to say it, because this always gets confused when one person of color, especially in such a predominantly white country as Poland, says something about the Black communities or about the perspective of the ethnic minority. They would be perceived as the representative of a general statement or a general attitude towards a certain issue. Joanna said I'm a linguist, and I do look at discourse and language use in terms of the public debate in general, and ways in which this discourse is shaped by stereotypes, by prejudices, by biases in the society. And in that sense, I also want to say a few words about Polish museum discourses, so what I've been observing, but it's not really my focal point of the research or my work. But I do have some insights, so I'm going to share them now. I think I will be asking more questions than giving answers. So the first question is this, how Africa and Africans are generally represented in Polish museum discourses. And this was partially answered in the last panel, speaking about the soldier from the Warsaw Uprising. But I want to give some general framing into it. So ways in which Black people and people of color of African descent are represented and portrayed through images, through discourse, through language, through picture descriptions in the exhibitions, but also in certain events that are related to arts, not only in exhibitions. The particular or the general discourse that is kind of a matrix, and what I see, because also it's related to the topic of our conference, decolonializing museums, is the dominant colonial discourse, right? So what I also see through the discursive ways of presenting Africans and Africa in general through different artifacts in museums is basically, an exposition of coloniality that is a continuing kind of process. It's not something that was in the past, as it's always referred to. So I'll give you some examples. So for instance, there is this museum in nearby Poznań, one of the biggest Polish cities, in Puszczykowo. It's a private museum, it's not a national museum. But when you enter the museum, there is this sign which says, this is a private museum of travel trophies. So this discourse of trophy, this discourse of objects and power, this is all built off to show off the wealth, the power, and the status. So I see this as like one of the, major frames of representing Africa and people of African descent in general. So people of African descent would be objectified, exoticized. Obviously, these are like wider narratives that we speak about right now. But the general narrative of the museums in Poland around Africa and around the people of African descent, but not only museums, because it's also prevalent in media, in education, in political discourse, and so on and so forth, is construed in this light of Western colonialism, in the light of white supremacy, policy of oppression. So I think it's important to just say it, that this discourse is a racist discourse, and it's explicit in ways in which certain, as we also said in the last, we saw in the last panel, certain artifacts, certain people, and certain communities of African descent are presented. And I'm talking about visual tools and about linguistic tools as well. So, for instance, one of the tool is representing also and ways in which we could look at the discourse, how discourse of people of African descent is presented, is to look at the ways in which Polish women, African women are presented. So the Black femininity, which is hypersexualized, is very often also referring to this case study of the Museum of Fiddler in Puszczykowo by Poznań. So Black women bodies which reproduce racist and sexist stereotypes with derogatory descriptions, like, referring to Black women's beauty, and just, referring to sexuality and the sexual potential. So it's also something general when we speak about the discourses of people of color or Black people in different kinds of realms, societal realms. This is prevalent too. So, for example, also another trope, because I'm going to be jumping now to something else, is also presenting the African perspective as less important, or as in, kind of like silence, because this is also a tool of discourse, that the perspective of the minorities, the voices of minorities in producing exhibitions, in producing events, are not taken into account often. Wise, and it's also happening in Poland. So people of color, or in particular Black people, are usually not involved or presented as experts. So, I'm coming from this position that I see museums as kind of, spaces where the academic perspective is more precious, more valued. And also academia in Poland is very white, right? So, and in academia is also white-centric. So from this perspective also, Black voices are not heard, because even if we talk about museums in general, even if we talk about decolonial perspective at museums, and this panel also obviously challenges my point right now, it's always perceived from this white perspective. So that's why it's difficult to move forward, to kind of, move from this perspective, silencing perspective, or this silencing strategy into something else. And this silencing is also seen when people challenge ways in which museums operate in that sense, in this colonial sense. So also a lot of denial strategies of museums that I observe also as an activist, so not as an academic. So when I speak to people, to curators, or when I try to kind of challenge the way in which Africans or people of African descent are represented, I always hear this, intention argument. So we did not intend that, because this is not exoticizing. Actually, it is exoticizing, but it's in a nice way. So it's just out of curiosity. We want to show a wide range of of the communities, which is not wide range because it's usually very often narrowed to exotic, to drums, to certain just areas of life. So I guess that looking at the ways in which museums deny it, but also, or people that represent museums, but also we as academics and activists perceive the coloniality, which was in the past, it's not now anymore. I think it's important to look at, and I'm not sure if if what I said really made sense, because I was really trying to be brief. But thank you so much for attention, because I got a note that I should finish now.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. It makes absolutely a perfect sense. I hope we will go back to that in the round of Q&As. And now I would like to ask our second speaker, Joanna Talewicz-Kwiatkowska, to share her perspective on how does it look from the perspective of Polish museums, how do they look from the perspective of Polish Roma community. We can't hear you, Joanna.
You need to.
Okay.
Okay, I hope that, okay, now it's okay. Okay, so hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very happy to be part of this roundtable discussion, and I hope that everything will be okay, because I received information that I have some problems with my connection with the internet. So I hope that I will be succeeded with this. Let me share my screen, because I have a few slides which I would like to show you. So let me start. Okay, and before I start, I would like to emphasize that today I will be focusing on representation of the Roma community in the Polish museums, and the significance of this representation in the perception of the Roma community in general. Daniel Baker, whose work titled Mirrored Books, which was a part of the exhibition Houses Silver Like Tents, presented at Zachęta National Gallery Art in 2013, said that the image of Roma in books and newspapers is not created by them. Baker, who is a British and Roma artist, collected 48 history books and novels about Roma minority, and copied their cover plates with mirrored surfaces, thus wanting to emphasize that the way of presenting and describing our community is a reflection of how others see or how others want to see our community. Romani people are not a homogeneous group. Migration, integration, assimilations, emancipations processes have diversified this society. Therefore, I would like to emphasize that the Roma are diverse as the general European non-Roma society community. They speak different dialects of language, their religion, and also social and economic situation depends on the country where they live. They have also different values and cultural norms. Roma people are also the biggest minority in contemporary Europe. And they have a minority status in every single country. It means that that Roma people don't have as much power, as much influence, let's say, over the creation own perception of this community. The visual arts defines reality. They influence the way we see the world, and they reflect what is part of our life experience. They also define the artist, their identity, community with which they identify. Roma artists have only recently taken advantage of this Roma was a monopoly of non-Roma artists, and Roma activity or activities in this area was described as a folk art, primitive, naive, and archetypical art. In other words, Romani works were represented as being less a work of individual artists and rather seen as collective cultural production. The first exhibition dedicated to Roma, entitled Roma History and Culture, was established in Poland during the communist period in 1979, and I would like to show you a few slides and pictures from this exhibition. And this exhibition was established in a museum in Tarnów, and since then the ethnographic museums in Tarnów has a section devoted to the history and culture our community. In addition, and I would like to emphasize also this, that educational materials for schools were designed based on the content presented in the exhibition. Few more pictures. As you see, many stereotypical pictures: Roma as a musicians, Roma as a nomads, Roma women as a fortune tellers. So very, very common and well-known stereotype. At this point, it should be added that the exhibition, although important and the first exhibition in Poland, is out of date and presents a stereotypical image, as I said before, or Roma community, which representatives and activists from the Roma community often disagree with. The first Romani themed exhibition organized on a national Polish an art gallery was a show at Zachęta in 2006. I had a pleasure to be curator of this exhibition. It was titled The Extermination of European Roma and Racism in Contemporary Europe, and it was prepared by two Roma organizations from Poland and from Germany. It was an extended version of the exhibition, which was opened in 2001 in Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. The Zachęta exhibition was unusual, as you see, for its location because of its focus on history. It was an exhibition that we don't usually see in galleries. However, importance of this topic, and above all, the fact that for so many years it had been almost absent from Polish public discourse, was the main reason for organizing this exhibition in Zachęta. As it was stated by Zachęta as a national gallery, it had a duty to show this document of persecution of Roma. Years later, actually a few years later, in 2013, the topic of the Roma returned to Zachęta. The act of returned to Zachęta, to National Gallery of Art. The act of colonizing the Roma often took place in the field of visual arts, as emphasized by the initiator and curator of this exhibition, Monika Wejhery-Waluszko, quoting the words of Tima Junghaus, who is director of European Roma Institute for Art and Culture in Berlin. At the exhibition, this was evidenced by both historical works and art of documents reproducing the common cliches and images of Roma. The exhibition also contained works by artists who describe Roma and who describe Romani world and more or less consciously distance themselves from these cliches, or as in the case of Roma artists, at the same time exploring the problem of their identity. So you can see also the pictures from the pictures and also installation from this exhibition from Zahenta. Today, Roma artists, like Roma intellectuals, are building a new Roma awareness. Educated and without complex, they boldly and proudly emphasize their origin. They reconstruct history and they create Roma culture, define the ways or the ways of presenting it. The culmination of this process was the organization of the first Roma pavilion at the 52nd International Art Biennale in Venice in 2007, and the first Roma Biennale, which was organized in Berlin in 2018. These events are evidence of the changing attitudes and perception of the Roma people, which is a consequence of contemporary reflection on society, ethnicity, and multiculturalism. It became obvious that art is also burdened with stereotypes about Roma, and those who evaluate and have excluded art created by Roma from the official canon, considering obsolete. Today, Roma artists also from Poland are active in many areas. In this worth mentioning at this point two successful Polish artists coming from the Roma community. I would like to mention about the Małgorzata Mirga-Tas and Krzysztof Gil, who both create the image of Roma which stands in opposition, let's say, to the dominant creation in the mainstream, in this example, Polish culture. In this way, they discover a new phase of Roma tradition, emphasizing its connection with contemporary culture. Moreover, they are fighting to be taken seriously by the viewer, because they realize that their work can be labeled as ethnographic art. For that reason, it is even more worth mentioning their success, and I'm happy to do this, which were described among others by the New York Times or Vogue magazine. And on this slide, you can see the work of an installation of Krzysztof Gil, which is titled Taisa, Yesterday and Today. The installation, which is combination of Baroque art and Dutch painting, and it refers to the history of Roma, and more specifically to the hunting of the Roma people, which was legal. For example, in 17th century in Germany, and in other European countries. This is also his work, which you can see inside installation. And the second one, Małgorzata Mirga-Tas, and she's work was presented during Biennale in Berlin, which was finished recently. And Małgorzata Mirga-Tas more directly, her art is more connected indirectly with the Roma culture, which became the leading theme or topic of her arts. The success of Roma artists is extremely important because artistic activities, of course, because of artistic activities have become one of the most also effective form of breaking the stereotypical image of the Roma. Moreover, the activity of Roma artists and their presence in the mainstream provoke a debate about the Roma culture, which in principle doesn't exist in the public space. And if it does, the form of representation of the Roma culture according to promote the work of Roma art, according to many, prevent the integration of this community. So perception of the Roma culture is very, very negative in this context. In such a climate, it's really difficult to promote the work of Roma Roma artists. Therefore, it's even more worth supporting this, those who, by breaking down successive barriers, become an important voice, not only in the field of art, but also in the movement of social and civil rights of the Roma in Poland and also in Europe. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Joanna, so much. Can we, yeah, thank you so much for presenting these diverse strategies and also the benefit with working with Roma artists in the Polish public scene. Now we move to the next speaker, to Lynn. Are you with us, Lynn? Yes, you are.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we are.
So first of all, thank you so much for being here. I think it's such a great initiative, very much needed and very timely, and it's so socially relevant. And I just want to start with a very simple and seemingly innocuous statement that, you know, we are here. People who look at me like me are here, they were here, and they will be here. But also people who do not look like me, but share the same history of arrival. So this kind of socialist roots of Eastern European multiculturalism, you know, students who came during the second and third world exchange from the newly decolonized non-alignment movements countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, etc. I mean, the communities are just here. So there is nothing extravagant about stating that. So, but the question is, what is the consequence of that? Because the fact that we are just here as kind of as a, if you want, historical fact, and that we occupy, you know, both worlds, if you want, is maybe perhaps not enough. It has proven that just because we are here, we're not being treated as full citizens. And one of my ways of dealing with that is to basically, through various strategies. But one of the ways is to engage with the museum. And I kind of came around because I started as an art history student and I kind of came back to it a bit. And basically museums, how I see them, they are quite of a hybrid space. So on the one hand, they can be allies. They can be a force of progressive thinking, of collective action. They can contribute to this kind of social transformation precisely because they occupy this mercurial in-between space, not an academic institution, not a clear-cut, like kind of top-down state institution, but also not a grassroots autonomous, you know, whatever neighborhoods initiative, for instance. But at the same time, as I said, the museum is a hybrid space. It can be an ally, but it can also be a conservative force that, you know, Margaret and Joanna talked about, where basically we are being wiped out, eradicated, we are being denied the voice, we are not even, and then if we have the voice, we are not being heard. But in my current project, okay, someone is calling, ringing the bell, but I'm going to ignore that person now. Just another obstacle in history, you know, against racism. But for this actually project that I want to talk about, I want to focus at on the museums as allies. And that means kind of acknowledging that museums are not just collections of dead objects, but actually museums are active participants, co-creators as institutions, as collections, but also as people, communities that are being formed around museums in producing knowledge. So we have to acknowledge and accept the fact that they are serious interlocutors and co-producers of discourses in a very powerful way, like Joanna said, that some minorities can actually, you know, co-opt, appropriate the space, or like Margaret is trying to do so. And that's what I'm trying to do. But my take is somewhat different. I'm not a curator. I'm a historian by training and an art historian. So my larger second project is about this kind of global socialism and the role of Eastern Europe as a broker, but also as this kind of creative space producing contacts between the global South and the Second World. And one of the subsections, sub-projects of this broader project is with my very good friend, Agata Pietrasik, an art historian from Poland, now based in Berlin. And we are actually writing an article based on this kind of systematic revision of the presence of the Vietnamese people, literally, but also any traces, signifiers of the Vietnamese in Polish museums collections. It can be, you know, from Zahenta to kind of small regional museums. And we're trying to kind of unearth, map out those different connections and interpret them. And one of the most beautiful, beautiful collection comes from Andrzej Strumiło, just to give you an example. And in trying to do that, we are trying to, first of all, like all of us, kind of make an intervention on the level of political representation, but also for me, because I am trained as an academic, so this is my discursive embeddedness, if you want, plus my background, is to basically undo this epistemic violence that is being done continuously, even unconsciously, even by progressive forces such as some curators, and not to blame anyone. I'm just saying that this is certain structures reproduce themselves that end up being co-opted by kind of form of epistemic dominant violence. And I'm just kind of sick of waiting for the miracle. So I'm not into dreams, I'm into reality and into facts. I just decided, okay, let's just write about it. Let's just acknowledge, we are here, we're staying here. And if we're not staying, it's up to us to decide. And we basically want to write an article, a serious, academic article that will combine our expertise. Agata Pietraszczyk is now having a project on history of exhibitions. And my expertise in global socialism and archival work, but also the fact that I occupy both worlds, and I'm kind of a broker, if you want, to use this term. And doing that, we kind of really want to intervene in this kind of knowledge production. We want to co-produce the knowledge, the story about me, my community. I want to be in control, if you want. I know it sounds naive and kind of perhaps in between empowerment, kind of empowerment speech, but I do really want to be the author of the meaning and have some kind of limited sense of control over that. And to claim ownership over my own history. And by doing that, the strategy is, again, it's kind of, and that relates to a bigger problem that I have, or like tension, if you want, that is the identity politics and the politics of representation. I think that politics of representation is great, is an important tool, but it's not a goal in itself. In other words, like every 5 years, an exhibition where there's like one Asian, whatever, Black, migrant, Polish artist, it's kind of not enough. I mean, it's nice, it's a sympathetic gesture, it's a benevolent gesture of the university or of the museum, but I think that we kind of need and should demand more. And one of the ways to do so is, again, kind of intervene in the kind of, really like appropriate the mechanism that produce knowledges, for instance, via the museum, and treat them as serious allies, as co-producers of this knowledge as well. So that would be my kind of, that is in the back of my head. That's the backdrop against which I'm operating. And okay, now we're entering the realm of dreams, and my real dream is to basically, through this article, on my book, is to basically show that this is not, again, an identity politics book. It's not about the experience of the Polish Vietnamese and Poland during late socialism, but it's actually to show that these are intimately connected stories of both Poland and Vietnam. My story is a story of Poland, the story of Poland is a story of Vietnam. Just to really show these connections, to bring kind of, not to create separation, right, but actually to overcome it, to bridge those histories, to say that you should care about this history because it's also your history, right? Just like what Margaret said, like, don't overburden a person of color, that he or she has to be a spokesperson, the token person that will talk about whatever intersectionality, gender, race, etc. class. Just also actively participate in it as a person from the mainstream, from the white majority in Poland. So that would be my dream, but I know it's, one academic article probably will not necessarily contribute to it. I'm not being megalomaniac here, but this is just to say that perhaps that's, one of the kind of few steps, just to show that some people who read this can kind of see it not as the stories of the faraway Vietnamese on our lands, Polish lands, but actually just like Jewish history is a Polish history, right? The same here, right? There's a kind of intimate, literally intimate connections, because there are lots of babies born of those interactions as well, of those contexts. So this is like literally the source of the Polish multiculturalism. So that would be my kind of big immaterial, if you want, a dream. But apart from that, I think that dreaming is nice, but I think it's time for action. So I think that we should really just start intervening and, and kind of now actively interlocuting the museum, just like Joanna is doing, as what Magda is doing, and other panelists in this roundtable. And I'm just doing it differently because I'm neither an archivist nor a curator. I think that I want to activate my strengths, and I think that this is through research, through kind of bringing alive the sources that are being kept, and this kind of beautiful, hidden but not really hidden, just like ignored collections that are being kept by generations of archivists in Polish museums. So that will be my strategy, and I think I'm kind of I wrap it up here because I'm a really quick speaker, so I think I have everything covered. Looking forward to the Q&As. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Now we will just give the voice to activists. I would like to recall in this context, I think that was Jacek Kuroń, the Polish one of the Polish dissidents, who said you should not burn the party committees, but you should set up your own. So you should not fight the party because it's going to be futile, but you can you can set up your own initiative. And this is where I would like to ask both Magda and then Karolina to talk a little bit about their own heritage activism around first, that would be the Jewish heritage, which Magdalena is active, the field Magdalena is active in.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Extremely interesting panel so far, so I'm very happy to be here. My name is Magda Rubenfeld-Korolewska. I'm one of the co-directors of Festival, which is an independent arts collective based in Krakow. We engage in complicated questions of kind of intersection of the Polish and the Jewish in whatever that might mean in contemporary Poland. We blend visual arts, community conversation, space interventions, performance, music, all kinds of types of art and activism in order to deliver a space that is ready for a nuanced and more kind of problematized conversation around about the Jewish reality in Poland. And I want to begin by telling you about one of the projects we're doing, which is not directly a museum project, but I think it connects very much to the questions of representation that were discussed here today. And that's a project called The Lucky Jew. The Lucky Jews are figurines and images that are sold in Poland for good luck. They are images of Jews holding money, counting money, admiring money in all kinds of representations. And by the majority of the public in Poland, they are perceived to be nice representations, even laudatory of the Jewish community. They are magical. They have powers to bring you economic luck. They are displayed at homes alongside the figurines of other saints, and they create this. They are meant to bring this prosperity into one's home, and of course for people who are coming from abroad or for the Jewish community who live here, these are much more complicated objects. And the fact that irony is missed, or that the double meaning and the echoes of anti-Semitic cliches are missed here by the majority of the public is symptomatic, I think, to the way that we in general in Poland perceive otherness, and in our context, how we perceive Jewishness. And I think that it somehow starts with the museums, because I think that the ways that ethnographic museums that Joanna mentioned, history museums portray other ethnic groups is very much this kind of image that then gets solidified and gets normalized and becomes something that if you add a coin, what's the problem? This is just a normal image of a Jewish person. What we've done with this images, we sort of, as Lynn was kind of set me up beautifully, we tried to reappropriate it again, and we've created a performance where a Jewish performer dressed up in a traditional sort of Jewish outfit goes out into the market, into the public space, and sells images of himself. Images, iPhone cases, mugs, all kinds of different gadgets, sits behind the frame and engages the audience in a conversation about what does it mean that these things bring you luck, and what kind of luck is it, and is it more lucky if you buy it directly from a Jewish person? So the performance is at the same time sincere and sarcastic, and we're trying to really bring this conversation to the people and ask the questions to them so that they can sort of rethink and reevaluate some of the opinions and stereotypes that they might themselves be holding. And that performance, I think, is something that led us to our next project, which I'll talk about, which is more directly related to the Ethnographic Museum in Krakow, which Erica was discussing yesterday, which is right in the center of the Jewish quarter in Krakow, in the building of a former Jewish school. And yet it is very, very difficult to find any references to the rich Jewish community, which existed at the same time as many items from the collection that are in the museum. And in fact, when any kind of representations, and this is a museum that has a slogan of "My Museum, Museum About Me," and it very broadly completely omits any sort of minority stories, and it's very difficult to find references to Jews, to Roma, to Belarusians in it. And the way that the Jewish community is portrayed in it is through these kinds of toys. And you see already that there's a lot of resemblance in how these images and the images of the lucky Jew sort of play with each other. And when you see these representations of Jews or the Jewish masks, when we started working with the museum, there was not even a commentary. These are just presented as the Jew. There isn't any critical reflection. There isn't any insight into what these might mean and what kind of implications they might have for example, children who come there on a regular basis. So here you see is a Jew mask, and there's no other additional commentary. So when we engaged with the museum for the first time, we were very reluctant to believe that the museum would actually want to cooperate with us, and that the museum would actually be our ally, as Lynn was saying. But we decided to try, and we were able to get them to speak to us and to actually agree that we would hold an open meeting with the museum director, who would be confronted with some of the audiences that were festival audiences that were used to a more critical viewing of museum spaces and museum curation. And it was an incredibly difficult meeting where a lot of really hurtful things were said from the audience to the museum director, which we were quite amazed about, but at the same time, we were pretty sure this was going to be our last collaboration with the museum, that they would basically never pick up the phone again. And we were very surprised to find out that not only they were ready to keep working with us, but they also decided to shift for the first time the collection in the way that it was curated, with the Jewish masks, which were really sort of the most hurtful object in the museum. And they decided to take them down and not put them up again until they've decided that they found another framework for them, which we were quite shocked to see that this was going to be something that this museum, which has a quite old-fashioned collection and curation of it, would be willing to undertake. And so the museum decided to take down the masks and bring them back only in forms of small black and white photographs with a critical commentary that was highlighting or was explaining some of the anti-Semitic connotations of those masks. So that was quite incredible for us. But of course, it didn't address the bigger issue. But it was nevertheless a change. We entered into a discussion with the museum about what we could do more, and we decided, and they've agreed to organize an intervention into the permanent collection by 4 artists, which were going to be picked by the festivals. Unfortunately, that never came to be because of COVID. But nevertheless, we have now pivoted, and we have moved to creating a projection which will be projected onto the walls of the museum from outside, so that we can, in a way, ask questions about what's inside the museum and how we should talk about these stories. And this is an intervention which also will have this element of appropriating of the narratives that were sort of taken from us in terms of what's inside the museum. We're hoping to have this be ready in December. It will be obviously open to the public, and we're hoping this way to bring more attention to what's inside the museum and to engage the audience in a more critical discussion. I think this is all what I have time for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magdalena, a lot. And we will immediately move to our final speaker, Karolina Ufa.
Yes, hello. Thank you for hosting me, and I'm just start sharing my presentation. Okay. There's something that, okay, sorry. One more time, I will open.
You can press Ctrl-L on your keyboard.
No, I think I'm okay right now. I'm really sorry. it's my first time on Zoom. So hello, my name is Karolina Ufan. I'm representing Fundacja Ku. So it's a NGO based in Warsaw. And exploring the subject on the conference, please allow me to focus a little bit on the very specific aspect of reshaping museum culture, that is queering Polish heritage institution. And first, I will tell you a little bit about condition of the Polish LGBT historical collection and why it's important for queering history, the Polish history. And then I will tell you a little bit about our project, that it's a first Polish virtual LGBTQI+ museum. And I will finish a little bit about some dreams and maybe tips for making Polish museum more inclusive. And first, I would like to start with the term queering. What is a queering? And it describes the practice of contesting stable sexes, gender, and sexualities. And queering is the location exploitation of incoherences in those three terms in order to destabilize heterosexuality.
Excuse me, Carolina, your presentation is not visible at the moment.
Okay. Should I start again?
Yes, and you should press share screen button on the bottom of the Zoom window.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I'm really sorry about this. Yeah. Okay, is it visible now?
Yes.
Yes, and now press Ctrl L to make it full screen. Okay.
Okay, I will be doing like this because I don't want to take precious time for a discussion maybe. Yes, and the main meaning of the queering in this speech is to uncover meanings and information about artifacts that do not perpetuate conservative ideas, but rather present artifacts in a way that contests heteronormative ideas about sexes, gender, and sexuality. And it was, as I was mentioned before, the museum has a powerful symbolism related to nationalism, tradition, and high culture, and I think it was mentioned by many of speakers before. And Queer Museum not only subverts conservative canon, but also places traditionally depreciated queerness in the podium of really important values in our national mindset. And it will be it's a double attempt to subverting museum, dealing with repression and socially uplifting queerness and freeing it from oppression. And but to realize this, it's this powerful double project. One has to access to national museums, and in Polish context, it's almost impossible task. And of course, like in 20th and 21st century, we have some history of queer exhibitions organized in galleries or alternative art center, also in National Museum. And it was really important for queer community, this Ars Homo Erotica that was taking place in 2010, the exhibition. But still, like none of the historical museum created or touched upon LGBTQI+ history so far. And we are still waiting for this, and we are, as a community, a little bit tired of waiting. So in team of few people, we decided that it's time to taking steps, and we created a virtual museum, and the creation of it is related to the archive of Historica Club, LGBTQI Femme, and Foundation Ku that were created in 2017. And initially, we were just a grassroots group on Facebook, and we wanted to popularize queer history, especially the beginning of the Polish activism in the 90s and in the years 2000. And we wanted to share just materials that we have, so magazines, journals, leaflets, pamphlets, and so on. And however, we figure out that the rough and working archival material have limited impact on the audience. And it takes a lot of energy and time and know how to process those historical sources, and that people are not used to getting conclusion out of information scattered around different sources. And of course, yeah, the material can give you, separate material can give you a glimpse at a specific case, but it's difficult to build a complex reflection on higher level. So we decided that we would like to have this space, create a space where we can share our materials, but we can also preserve them, present them, and use for educational purposes. And in this way, our museum showed the archive and our collection in more synthesized and understandable way. And it makes marginalized narrative more visible and tells the story of non-heteronormative community constant existence alongside a heteronormative majority. And funny thing is that in contrast to physical museum, the virtual one doesn't entail renting space, buying display furniture, insuring exhibits. So basically it's free of charge. And it's in the range of our NGO that is mostly based on voluntary work of activists and volunteers and people interested in sharing the queer history. So this is the website. And so far we hosted the 3 exhibitions, and the first one showcased posters of Polish LGBTQI organization. And we wanted to tell the story of queer activities by posters. The next 2 were about Action Hyacinth. And now we are ready with 3 other exhibitions. 2 are about lesbian and queer activists. And the third one is about early history of activism in 90s in Poland. And what is worth mentioning is that the museum was created in cooperation with Google Arts and Culture. And it's not always the easy cooperation, and several times we're obliged to change exhibit material because of internal rules, for example, nudity policy. Yeah, here are our exhibition and challenges. So because of the nudity policy, and we are asked constantly about change of showed visual materials because it's considered too erotic. And one of the photos that you can see of this couple was considered as too erotic because first we showed the belly button of the guy in front, and then there was some opposition against the two-man hug. So we are all the time dealing with the censorships and how to show the material that we have in the way that we can present it. And on the other way, we are having some ethical questions concerning publication of the oral history, because we are also recording oral history, mostly about the oral history of the activists that were active in the 90s, the beginning of the 90s, who are like the leaders of the movement, LGBT movement in Poland. And we are all the time constantly thinking how we can reveal the data, how much we can reveal, and what will be the outcome of such implication. And concerning all those lack of and complete diverse LGBT stories in our institution and implicitly heteronormative tendencies of museum, it's crucial to find a way in which museum can be more inclusive. And of course, there are multiple ways to try and accomplish it, but I would like to mention 3 strategies for creating museum, and also there are somehow my dreams that what I would like to see in the collections and in the exhibitions. And the first is the very simple and very basic, just highlighting the sexual orientation of artists, authors, heroes and heroines shown in the exhibitions. So this shows a positive and respectful image of queer people and create awareness of diversity. And this strategy can really affect queer visitors by offering the queer role models that we are lacking nowadays in our educational system and so on. The second one strategy is just setting up a queer exhibition. So the strategy is about destabilize sexes, genders, and sexuality by focusing on queer topics. And this offers information and creates awareness about queer people and their lives, and it provides stories to the visitors that are not often heard in the museum and offers knowledge about queer people and their lives. And it's very important to let people from the community itself to create an exhibition as a bottom-up procedure. and offer them a space where they can share their own story. So this is really beneficial for the community, but also for the non-heteronormative, for the other visitors, because it teaches empathy. And the last strategy, maybe the most effective one, is using a queer perspective as an interpretive tool. And it's about expose the work of frames by switching the perspective on the object and offering multiple meanings behind the object. So it offers a queer perspective on seemingly non-queer artifacts, and therefore shows that queer people, stories, and objects are everywhere. And yes, and it might help changing the perspective of these visitors by giving them a queer lenses through which they view the content of the museum. And I think that, yeah, museum has a social responsibility towards a society and marginalized group to represent them, and we should try to change it. So thank you a lot for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Carolina, and thank you so much to all of you for your absolutely wonderful insights. Before we have a few, there was a kind of discussion on chat, which everyone can follow. There were also a few questions, which I will just ask in a moment. I would also like to add one of my own questions to that poll. Starting was Margaret was saying at the very beginning, kind of a danger of essentializing. So we are, at the one hand, we would really like to include include to the museum discourse the participants of the minorities and of the diverse communities in Poland. At the other hand, they are there, and also they are tiny. So we tend to essentialize in a way that we take one person and ask her or him to speak for the community, which is very much diverse. And that would be, if we have a little bit time after answering the question of chat, I would also like to reflect you on your own positionality or your own situatedness in the overall discourse, because you are, you are very well educated scholars or activists, and how actually that what you do, how does it relate to the communities with which you are sometimes associated with, and how do you feel yourself of kind of the spokeswoman or spokesperson, or you wouldn't like to do so, but you are forced into that position, like in a situation like a panel like this. So that would be my question for a reflection, for your final reflection later on. But now we had a few questions from our audience. The first one was, sorry, it was just the question from the whole. Okay, I just asked the question from Erica, so I think it was at the end, but I have it in my Google Docs as the first one. Erica asked, I'm wondering about whether there is any discussion of intersectionality in Polish progressive politics in such project. Is the activism always in these communities, or is the recognition that there are, for example, queer Jews or queer Blacks? Then a question, that was a question to all of you. Then there was a specific question to Margaret, but not only. What would be, in your opinion, the critical decolonial way or ways of presenting travel trophies of, for example, in situ preserve aristocratic collections, while at the same time preserving the 18th, 19th century presentation mode of these historical residences? And finally, there is a question from Maria about still the use of the word gypsy and Roma. How do you, what would you recommend, Joanna? So that's a question from Maria. And a question from Shelley to Carolina. Can you give a specific example of showing how an everyday object can be interpreted differently with a queer lens? And my request to Carolina, if you could just type a link to your virtual museum in chat, that would be helpful for to everyone. So if you could make a round of answered in the same in the same order as we started, starting with Margaret. I think that would help us to fight against the running time. Margaret.
Sure. Yeah, I think in some extent I answered the question about critical ways of responding, of presenting travel trophies. Yeah, the question that was addressed to me by museums. I truly believe in education, and for me, critical education is crucial in democratic societies. And also the role of museums is to educate. So I guess, you know, somehow, as I said in the chat already, a critical assistance or a critical explanation, commentary, something that I guess Lynn was referring to as well, would be beneficial for the visitors who are maybe not as much aware, especially young visitors, youth, not as much aware of the processes that were in the past, and they are not aware of James Clifford, James Geertz, for instance, theories and, you know, things like that, that museums should stay in the museum. It's like for them, they come and they see it as something that it is. So for me, oh, actually it wasn't Lynn, sorry, it was Magda who was presenting us this strategy from the Jewish Museum, the response of the museum, where they put all these comments about the stereotypes, for instance, so it doesn't have to be done through the curator. So I'm trying to look at it in a, like, from a pragmatic you know, position perspective. So what can be done in a pragmatic way? Like, what could be a first step? So the first step, in my opinion, should be highlighting these critical points and critically analyzing them and presenting this analysis to the audience. And then next thing would be a systemic change, which I don't really have an idea how to change that, but definitely on a structural level, institutional level. So for instance, you know, if we think about people that come to the museum as a visitor, we think mainly in Poland of, you know, white people, right? So we don't think of people who are presented in these exhibitions. So in a way, they are excluded from this imaginary audience or imaginary visitors, the community of visitors. So in that sense, museums are not inclusive because they assume that the museum is for like a general audience, and in Poland, general audience is white. So it's not representatives or not members of marginalized communities. And it's not only, of course, I'm not only referring to racial or ethnic identities of people that visit museums.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Thanks. Joanna, are you with us? We might lost Joanna. Okay. Lynn, would you like to add something? We'll come back to Joanna later because I think she lost the connection. But we can now, Lynn, I think the question about residences is also about historical residences. Maybe you would also like to come back to the one. I mean, how to, because there was a question about how to present the trophies, the colonial trophies in the historical residence and you know, aristocrat palaces, but also how what take on this.
I mean, there was this kind of, I know not a lot about curating, history of curating, but there definitely was this kind of educational turn in curating, where museums of contemporary art try to kind of distance themselves from presenting, you know, sexy objects that can be sold in Art Basel by actually generating knowledge and kind of creating archives and being active participants with the local communities. And I think that that is one of the ways, perhaps, you know, just to see how museum can really just like give parts of its infrastructure, its know-how to the communities so that they can just start doing their own thing there. But speaking, I thought of this kind of how to present the trophies. I feel like there is always some kind of violence and ambivalence inscribed in that very act of displaying them. I honestly don't think that we can go, get rid of that easily. But what immediately came to my mind is the artwork of this Danish Vietnamese artist who's actually queer himself, who came from the kind of refugees families to Denmark on a boat from South Vietnam. You write it Dan Vo, but you can't actually pronounce it Yan Vo. So Dan Vo, maybe some of you saw it because he at a certain point gained a lot of visibility and fame. So he was very successful in the art scene. And I very much liked how he plays with these colonial aesthetics and how he politicizes them by having very subtle gestures. So he's like on a completely different spectrum than, for instance, this kind of educational term. He's not interested in producing books. So he literally brings illegally objects from Vietnam and shows them in Swiss white cube institutions like spaces. And I kind of like it a lot. But speaking about my own situatedness, I think that's a very tricky, it's a very hard question. And that's also something that Erica mentioned in her lecture, that this complicated relationship with the ethnographic museum was her, as I remember you said, like your major drama. And I was like, I totally see that. And I think that all of us here, we don't write this out of some kind of distance, scientific, we don't have like a distant scientific subjectivity here, because it's a very personal, very hard and very emotional labor that is put into kind of tackling these type of issues. And my own situatedness is very much, very ambivalent, because on the one hand in the US, I'm kind of a typical model minority, right? I'm a typical successful, whatever, second generation Asian, academic, whereas in Poland, that is not the case, because the Vietnamese minority does not look very optimistically at when kids want to study the humanities. Right? It's still like engineering, economics, whatever, law, and so on. And on top of it, I'm also married to a person who is German-Turkish. So there's a lot of things that are happening here that I feel like my own situatedness is very complicated, but at the same time, I do think it's very Polish in many ways. Through my work, one can see it, through the way I engage with things. That's the paradox. It's Polish, but it's also in many ways, completely beyond any category. And answering Erica's questions on intersectionality, I really don't know I think that you should ask Margaret and others, because I think that they know better than me what's happening on the ground. But like because I taught a course on racism and critical whiteness studies in Berlin, I use this term a lot. It became actually for me a standard vocabulary that talks, and it has this kind of roots in feminist Black thought and kind of talks to all these different axes of oppression. So I think it's very helpful, tremendously helpful. And I hope that it's being somehow appropriated by the communities, like activist communities in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Is Joanna with us? Did you manage, Joanna, to reconnect? No, not really. Okay, sorry. So, Magdalena? Oh, God.
No. I'm here. Okay, so maybe I'll go with your question, Joanna, about essentializing, because I think it's incredibly interesting, also in the context where we're often not being given a voice, even in discussions about curating or presenting the narratives that pertain to the community. And then when you do have that voice finally, and you have the seat at the table, you are the only one who's representing the community. And so you have to somehow be the representation as best as possible. I mean, the way that we have been trying to address it, I guess, is to just build partnerships that are as wide as possible. And for example, the project I presented or talked about, the projection on the ethnographic museum, will be also done in collaboration with Erica, the different artists who are presenting different kind of representations of the community. We're trying to partner with the museum and bring in as many different organizations into the equation. We have another interesting museum engagement around a museum that's being established on the site of a former concentration camp of Płaszów in Krakow, where essentially the city has decided to, after 70 years of neglect, build a museum of the site, but in a way that completely doesn't include a discourse with the local residents. And it's right now, this is one of the major important green areas in that area. And of course, there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen once there's a museum and once that area becomes more of a tourist area. And we sort of took advantage of the fact that the Jewish community wasn't really part of the community consultations. And we leveraged that by saying, you know, we want to have a voice, and we're now trying to sort of be the mediator between the residents and the city. But of course, that's incredibly hard because there's so much already emotional and sort of emotional labor on both sides, and both sides are exhausted. And we, as the side that was omitted and our voice wasn't really being heard, have to now sort of hold their hand through it and make sure that everybody's kind of okay and can find a middle ground. So these situations are sometimes really absurd. But at the same time, it's incredibly important for us that this museum is established in a way that includes the voice of the residents, and that it's not a site that's contested, that creates more anti-Semitism, that creates resentment, but that somehow is able to be done in a way that's responsible. At the same time, of course, we believe that something needs to happen to that site. So it's incredibly difficult dilemmas, I think, but I'm really happy that these conversations at least are happening, and that there is, as I've kind of seen with our work with the Ethnographic Museum and now hopefully Płaszów, that things can be changed, that it very often is not because of that it really is kind of ignorance or, you know, lack of education that Margaret was saying, and lack of context and connection with the local community to even ask them. I don't think that if I were to ask the representatives of the municipality of Krakow, you know, who they would call for advice on Roma topics, they wouldn't probably necessarily know who to ask. So I think, unfortunately, that's where we have to do a bit more work ourselves, as otherwise nobody will necessarily ask us.
I think Joanna managed to connect with us, but let's give her a moment to check the connection for sure. But there was another question to Lynn from Alexandra Łanka. Lynn, Alexandra asked, what do you think are the implications of the constant emotional labor and the possibilities of decolonizing the museums? And I think it's a question to everyone, if someone would also, if other speakers would like to add to this one.
I honestly, this is such a hard, I think it's a very relevant question and very important one, but I honestly don't know, because I am, I think, at the level of my life where I try to actually live with this emotional exhaustion. But I do think that actually it is, I think that one has to first of all acknowledge it and be able to live with it and then work with it, in the sense that it is also like a source of passion. It's a source of commitment. And if you want, it can also be like this kind of driving force, because, you know, we are not just rational beings only who engage in abstract exchange of ideas, you know, and arguments, but we actually have this kind of embodied reactions and feelings. And I use emotions as a kind of rather expansively. So it's not just, you know, fear or joy, but it's also trust. It's also being calm and so on. So I think that I would try to see them as a kind of resources, are very hard to work, the one that it's very hard to work with. But for example, the case of Margot, I don't know if you heard of this queer activist in Poland. I mean, she has been so inspiring for me. I literally read every single article with her, and I thought I loved the energy, I loved the, you know, the analytical sharpness that she had, and the fact that she understands so many things while being so young. So for me, this is the kind of the passion that kind of leads you to kind of contributing to some kind of a social transformation. And just to put in the comment, actually my PhD is on Jacek Kuroń, who is like a very passionate political activist as well. So for me, yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just too naive now, I don't know. But I do think that perhaps you should just try to see it as a resource to work with and to acknowledge, rather than trying to repress it and be unhappy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Karolina, would you like to add something to that round of the discussion?
Yes, I would like to answer the question about the queer object, because actually I have two really interesting examples, but from Scandinavian countries. So first of the example is from Sweden. It's from Viking Museum. And one of the queer scholar who was working on the exhibition there, queer exhibition there, mentioned once example of two skeletons. So it was two male skeletons with the baby. It was like a grave. They discovered the grave, and the first idea was, yeah, that they are just like two brothers with the kid buried somewhere, and the two Vikings. And then I think after some time they made a DNA test and they figured out that there are no connections, so it cannot be a brother. And it giving this idea to think about like how easily we just categorize that if we find the graves, it's usually the brothers, because it's impossible in the old times, Viking times, to have maybe a homosexual relationship with the child or something like this. And the second example is from Iceland, from the National Museum of Iceland. They also create like the special guide through the exhibition, and the name of exhibition is Making a Nation, Heritage and History of Iceland. And the name of the audiobook that everyone can hear, it's The Rainbow Thread. And they made or showed two really interesting examples. And one of them was the photo of the two men kissing. And in the 16th, 17th century, it was the custom in Iceland. So every time the hosts were leaving, like the guests were leaving the house, they were kissed in the lips. And it raises the questions about like, if the kiss of two men is always thinking as a homosexual act or not, and how these customs are developing. And the second one was about what is the queer artifact and object, and it was a butter knife. So one of the organizations, the early organization, queer organization in Iceland, donate a butter knife with their signature, and there was a whole discussion like what kind of objects can be queer artifacts. Yes, so yeah, this discussion was about that anything can be the queer artifact and queer object. You just need to give this, the explanation and so on.
Yeah, thank you so much. As Joanna with us, I would like to go back to the Erika's questions from the beginning. From some of you have already answered, but maybe Joanna want to tackle from your perspective. So Erika asked, I'm wondering about whether there is any discussion of intersectionality in Polish progressive politics in such project. Is the activist always in these communities, or is there recognition that there are, for instance, queer Jews, queer Blacks, or queer Roma people? How Joanna, how do you see it?
Okay, so thank you for your patience as well, because I have a problem with the internet, but thanks God I'm here. Okay, so how I see this, I mean, I think that it's an absolutely relevant question and also discourse which should be implemented into discussion about minorities groups, also about Roma, but it's completely new also in among Roma community. I mean, after so many attacks towards LGBT community in Polish Roma community, we started a discussion about Roma, LGBT and Q people, but for many older represents and leader, it's still topic which shouldn't be discussed among our community, because it's in the opposition with let's say conservative culture. But for younger generation, for also younger leaders, for educated people, it's also topic which is discussed and described, and also in international level, it's also topic which is important subject of the conferences, of the reports even, and so I think it's we observe very important beginning of the discussion about intersectionality in our community. When it comes to Poland, Polish society and politics, I'm not sure, but probably most of you know what kind of atmosphere we have right now in Poland. So I think that I can see, I can speak about my community, because I have a knowledge about this. But I think that it's also next step. I mean, we still, let's say, fight for perception of Roma people as part of a social community and the Polish society as educated people, as people who are not dancers, who are not nomads, because still that kind of perception is dominant in Polish discourse, unfortunately. So now we have to confront with this cliches and so many stereotypes that I think that we are so far from discussion about intersectionality in Polish society in the context of Roma people.
Yeah. Thank you, Joanna. Now to go back to the Carolina again. So the question to you, as you can see in the chat, is queer discourse always a white one? How does it look like?
Unfortunately, I would say yes. But I would like to also mention that inside the queer community, there's also the discourse about like the power of each of the letter in the acronym. So, for example, in our terms, in our case of the archive and museum, we have a lot of information about the gay and gay history and gay activists, but we are still lacking sources and materials from lesbian organizations, from transgender people, bisexual people. So yeah. This is my answer. So yes, we are like really, really narrowed and closed, and I don't think soon there will be possibility to open up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, everyone. We need to come to the conclusion. It was a fascinating discussion for me. I mean, it was great listening to you and to the project. And I do hope we will continue, we'll certainly continue some of these topics during the conference. So there would be a panel, for instance, on representation of Africa in several Polish museums. So that's, I think, tomorrow. But also some other topics will pop up. But I do also hope that we will manage to continue that discussion beyond that conference and somehow to network and collaborate on those issues. Thank you so much to the audience.